Hey, glad you made it. Today's story begins with a college student having a quiet lunch break and ends with a global medical mystery, a secret laboratory, and a poison so rare it's been documented only 3 times in the past century. At first, it looked like food poisoning. Then it got weirder: brain swelling, numbness, and a metallic taste no one could explain. But the real twist? This wasn't a freak illness. It was intentional. So how did a young man end up as the subject of one of the rarest diagnoses in modern history? And who would do something so cruel just to see what happens? Let's get into it. It was late afternoon on July 29th, 2016. Felix, a 23-year-old college student, stood in the break room at the manufacturing company where he worked part-time in northwestern Germany. He poured cereal into a bowl, grabbed his carton of lactose-free milk from the shared fridge, and sat down at the table with 2 older co-workers, Otto and Klaus, both in their 50s. Felix, who was studying engineering, worked here as a machine technician between classes. Being one of the youngest workers, he often felt out of place. Today was no different. Otto and Klaus didn't even glance up as he sat down. They just ate in silence. After a few awkward minutes, Felix tried to break the ice. "Hey guys, how's your day going?" Klaus didn't say anything, just shrugged and kept chewing. Otto looked up, grimaced, and said, "Not great. Headache, stomachache. I feel off." Felix nodded, unsure how to respond. The conversation ended just as quickly as it started. They went back to eating in silence. A few minutes later, Felix tossed out the rest of his cereal, headed back to the floor, and suddenly doubled over in pain. Sharp cramps tore through his abdomen, almost knocking the air out of him. Felix was used to stomach pain. He was lactose intolerant, and eating dairy always triggered these symptoms. But he had just used his own milk. It was supposed to be safe. Worried, he ran back to the break room, opened the fridge, and checked the carton. It was definitely his. Something wasn't right. Nausea hit hard. He rushed home, barely making it to the bathroom before vomiting. When the worst passed, he rinsed his face at the sink, but then paused. His fingertips were tingling. His hands were going numb. He flexed his fingers. Nothing helped. The sensation kept spreading. Spooked, Felix did the only thing he could think of. He called his mom. 2 weeks went by. On his mother's advice, Felix visited a doctor. The diagnosis? Probably just overworked. He was told to rest and take vitamins, but rest didn't help. He wasn't just nauseous anymore. The tingling had spread up his arms. He couldn't walk properly. He barely left his bed. On a day when he tried to shower, his legs buckled. He crawled back to bed, defeated, and called his mom again. This time not for advice, but for help. She drove him to the hospital. A neurologist examined him, testing his reflexes, vision, and ability to feel touch. Felix couldn't feel much of anything in his arms. His muscle control was fading. The doctor suspected inflammation in his central nervous system, maybe his brain or spinal cord. It could be caused by an infection or an autoimmune reaction. She admitted him for testing. 6 days later, she returned to find Felix much worse. His body was limp, his face swollen, and his eyes unfocused. Brain scans confirmed inflammation in both the brain and brainstem. Yet every infection test came back negative. The doctor leaned toward an extreme autoimmune reaction, but without proof and with no effective treatment, she could only try to ease his symptoms. Anti-inflammatory meds did nothing. Then Felix said 2 words. "Metal mouth." He tried to explain. "Taste. Water." He couldn't even swallow properly. The water dripped down his chin. That metallic taste, it didn't fit any diagnosis the neurologist could think of. She transferred Felix to a university hospital with more specialists. By the time he arrived, his kidneys and liver were shutting down. The doctors at the university hospital were just as confused as the ones before. Felix's condition was getting worse, not better. His brain was inflamed. His speech was nearly gone. His limbs were almost useless. Now, his internal organs were failing too. But all the infection tests came back negative. Again. The autoimmune theory didn't seem to hold up either. There were no antibodies attacking his tissues, no clear trigger. The team was running out of ideas and running out of time. By September, 2 full months after Felix first got sick, he was in a near coma. Most days he was unconscious. He could no longer eat or talk. He barely responded to light or touch. At this point, most doctors could only keep him alive. But one physician refused to give up. He believed Felix's case still had an answer. It just had to be extremely rare. So he took a different approach. Instead of retesting Felix for things they'd already ruled out, he started digging through obscure medical journals. He read case studies, research reports, and long-forgotten documentation from other hospitals. And then he found something. One article described a patient who'd experienced the exact same symptoms in the exact same sequence. First came the stomach pain and vomiting. Then the numbness and tingling in the limbs. Next, the loss of coordination, followed by brain swelling. Then a metallic taste in the mouth. And finally, complete organ failure, just like Felix. The condition in that paper wasn't caused by bacteria, it wasn't viral, and it wasn't autoimmune. It was poisoning. Specifically, an incredibly rare and intense form of mercury poisoning. So rare, in fact, that it had only ever been reported 3 times in the past 100 years. The doctor didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he decided to run a blood test to rule it out. He expected it to come back negative. It didn't. The test confirmed Felix had mercury poisoning. At a concentration so high, it would be considered a lethal dose for most people. Now the mystery wasn't medical anymore. It was criminal. How had Felix been poisoned? The doctor called the police. Investigators jumped in quickly. They spoke to Felix's family, his doctors, and anyone he regularly interacted with. They retraced his steps. They tested everything: his water, his food, his bedding, even the air in his home. No traces of mercury were found. Weeks passed. Nothing surfaced. Felix, meanwhile, slipped into a deeper vegetative state. By the end of the month, he was completely non-responsive, alive, but barely. And still, no one else was sick. There were no other mercury poisoning cases in the area. No reason to believe the community was at risk. Eventually, the case went cold. Felix stayed in that state for more than 2 years. Doctors tried to manage his symptoms, but there was no recovery. It seemed the mystery of how he got poisoned would remain unsolved forever. Until one day, in May of 2018, back at Felix's old workplace, something changed. Otto, the older man who had complained about feeling sick during that awkward lunch break, was now in kidney failure. He needed dialysis just to stay alive. A second employee, a younger man named Elias, had been suffering from intense stomach pain, far worse than the usual colds and aches common at the factory. But neither Otto nor Elias thought much of it. People got sick at work all the time. They didn't connect it to Felix or to each other. That is, until Elias sat down for lunch one day and noticed something strange. A powder. A fine, silvery dust was scattered across the surface of his sandwich. It didn't look like any spice or seasoning. Just wrong. Alarmed, he called the police. Authorities responded immediately. They confiscated the sandwich and tested it. The results? Heavy metals, lead, cadmium, and something else, mercury. The investigation reopened overnight. Once the test confirmed mercury and other heavy metals were present in Elias's food, police swarmed the workplace. They sealed off the break room, shut down the fridge, the microwave, and inspected everything, every snack, every plate, every container. Then they checked the locker room. Inside one locker, tucked behind a set of folded work clothes, they found something. A small vial. It was sealed tightly and unlabeled. Inside it was a metallic-looking fluid. The lab confirmed it immediately. Elemental mercury. They had their evidence. Now they needed a suspect. They reviewed security footage. Because the factory had recently added cameras to the lunch area after an unrelated incident, police could finally piece together who had access to which items in the break room and when. One man stood out. He was always the first one into the room. He often hovered near the fridge. On more than one occasion, he handled containers that didn't belong to him. That man was Klaus. Yes, the same Klaus who had sat next to Felix at that lunch table back in July of 2016. When police searched his home, what they found was even more disturbing. He wasn't just storing mercury. He had an entire collection of lab equipment, chemical samples, and toxic substances, some banned, others highly restricted. He had books on poisons, research notes, a chemical catalogue. It looked like a small-scale personal laboratory. And he wasn't a scientist. He had no license, no training, no legitimate reason to have any of it. He was arrested on the spot. Once in custody, Klaus didn't speak. Not during the arrest. Not during interrogation. Not during trial. He gave no reason, no confession, no explanation for what he did. But the evidence was overwhelming. In 2019, Klaus was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to life in prison. As for Felix, miraculously, after years in a vegetative state, he began to show signs of improvement. Very slow, very small signs. He started responding to voices. Then he could open his eyes. Then one day, he blinked, on command. Felix was waking up. And though he has a long road ahead, he is now aware, responsive, and receiving intensive rehabilitation. He is still recovering, but he survived. And now, his case is officially one of the rarest medical poisonings ever documented. So let's talk about it. What kind of person does this? Poisoning co-workers in secret, watching them fall sick, and never saying a word? This story is a haunting reminder that some threats aren't loud or obvious. Sometimes danger wears a uniform, sits at your lunch table, and nods while you talk about your day. The lesson here: stay aware, and never ignore your instincts, especially when something feels off. If this one sent chills down your spine, hit that like button, subscribe to my channel, and share it with someone who enjoys true stories that sound like thrillers but are terrifyingly real.